It was just another Tuesday morning in Dayton, Ohio. Blue skies, checkout lines at Kroger, and 47-year-old Mary Jacobs promising her daughter over the phone she'd be home in time to cook dinner. She never made it back. By nightfall, her silver sedan sat in the lot as if abandoned mid-thought. Groceries in the back, her purse on the seat, phone fully charged. No accident, no struggle, no goodbye. What began as an ordinary errand spiraled into one of Dayton's most enduring mysteries, a case that would grip the city for a decade. Only years later would investigators uncover the truth, proof that Mary had not simply vanished, but had crossed paths with someone who believed they could bury their crime forever.
Before we dive into this crime case, make sure to hit the subscribe and like this video. Now, back to the case.
The day had been an ordinary one in Dayton, Ohio. A mild May afternoon, skies painted a soft blue, the streets alive with the casual bustle of errands and work breaks. Mary Ellen Jacobs, 47 years old, moved through it like any other weekday. She had a rhythm, a routine that rarely faltered. Drop her daughter at school, head to work at the insurance office, and pick up groceries before dinner. She was dependable, rooted, the kind of woman whose life never suggested mystery or menace. At 10:47 a.m., a Kroger supermarket camera captured her final known image. The grainy security footage, later shown endlessly on the news, froze her in time. Pushing a cart across the parking lot, balancing her phone against her ear with one hand, and shielding her eyes from the sun with the other, on the call was her daughter, just finishing class at the community college. Mary's voice, cheerful but rushed, promised, "I'll be home soon, honey. I'll make dinner tonight. Something special." Her daughter laughed, telling her not to overdo it. Then the call ended. Witnesses remember small, almost forgettable details. Mary in a light blue checkered blouse, her jeans slightly frayed at the ankle, her silver sedan parked near the far edge of the lot. A regular customer recalled seeing her glance briefly toward another row of cars, as if noticing something. But the moment passed quickly, lost in the hum of engines and shopping carts. What no one knew at the time was that the boundaries of her life, her family, and her community were collapsing right there in that parking lot. Hours later, her daughter tried calling again. No answer. By dinner time, the house felt too quiet. Groceries never arrived, the stove stayed cold, the family clock ticked into unease. At 8 p.m., her husband drove to the Kroger himself, half annoyed, half worried. That annoyance curdled into dread when he saw her silver sedan still parked in the lot. Inside the trunk were bags of food, wilting vegetables, and melting ice cream pooling at the bottom. Her purse sat on the passenger seat, her wallet and phone untouched. The car looked less like an abandoned vehicle and more like a moment interrupted, a life paused mid-sentence. Police arrived within the hour, their flashlights cutting across the asphalt. One officer leaned into the driver's seat and stared at the illuminated phone screen. Battery full, no calls made after 10:47 a.m. The last ping placed it right here in the lot. Then silence. In the days to come, that silence would spread into news reports, into whispered conversations at church, into the hearts of her children. Neighbors would leave porch lights burning, hoping it might guide her home. Flyers would flutter across telephone poles. And a city that had seen its share of hardship would find itself facing a story that pierced deeper than crime statistics. A mother who vanished in daylight. A routine errand turned into a chilling mystery. For now, though, all anyone had was that single frame from the surveillance camera. A woman with a shopping cart, a smile in her voice, a promise of dinner waiting to be made. A fragment of the ordinary, frozen just before the extraordinary darkness swallowed her whole. Mary Ellen Jacobs walked out of Kroger on May 15, 2012. She never came home. The scene at Kroger lingered like a half-finished painting. Mary's car was locked, the windows rolled up, her belongings untouched. The police towed it for examination that same evening, hoping for fingerprints, tire impressions, anything to indicate where she had gone. But the strangest thing about that car was how normal it looked. Groceries still lined the back seat. Bread, a carton of eggs, a bouquet of flowers she had picked up at the last minute. Nothing suggested a struggle. No cracked glass or signs of forced entry. It was as though Mary had stepped out of her life for just a moment and never returned. Her husband, Thomas Jacobs, insisted Mary wasn't the type to walk away. She'd never leave her kids, not for a second, he told investigators that night. She called me over every little thing. When the car made a noise, when she thought the mail was late. She would have called if something was wrong. His words hung heavy in the police interview room. Investigators pieced together her last known movements. The checkout receipt from Kroger showed 10:41 a.m. She paid in cash, as she often did, and thanked the cashier politely. By 10:47, the camera caught her heading for the car. Then nothing. No footage of her driving away. No record of her leaving the lot. Detectives canvassed the parking area, asking witnesses if they'd noticed anything unusual. One woman vaguely remembered a man leaning against a dark-colored SUV 2 rows away. Another recalled a metallic clang, as though something dropped. But none of the accounts fit neatly together. That night, Thomas stayed awake until dawn, pacing the living room, checking his phone every few minutes as if the next vibration might deliver Mary's voice. Their daughter sat curled on the couch, clutching the blanket her mother used to fold neatly after laundry. The absence pressed on the family like a physical weight, turning ordinary silence into something unbearable. Forensic teams combed the car. On the driver's doorframe, they lifted a faint smudge, possibly a handprint, but the ridges were incomplete. Inside, they bagged a set of grocery bags, including the melted ice cream dripping across the upholstery. The strange detail came from the passenger side floor, a single quarter, shiny as if newly dropped. The Jacobs family swore Mary never carried loose change. Meanwhile, cell phone records deepened the mystery. After the 10:47 call with her daughter, the phone made no outgoing calls, no texts, no data usage. The signal last connected to a nearby tower covering the Kroger parking lot. At 11:02, it went completely dark, as if someone had shut it off deliberately. Speculation rippled quickly. Could Mary have been abducted in broad daylight? Or had she willingly gotten into someone else's car? Detectives weighed both options, but neither aligned with her character. Friends described her as cautious, sometimes overly so, the kind of woman who triple-checked door locks and avoided walking alone at night. Then came the first unsettling lead. A gas station clerk half a mile away reported seeing a woman resembling Mary around 11:15 a.m., seated in the passenger seat of a dark vehicle, possibly a van. She looked upset, like she didn't want to be there. But the clerk admitted he hadn't seen her face clearly. The sighting, frustratingly vague, was enough to spark theories, but not enough to confirm anything. As hours bled into night, investigators realized the case was already slipping from routine procedure into something much more troubling. Missing person reports often carried a faint hope of resolution within the first day or two. A mix-up, a car accident, a detour. But here everything was too neat, too staged. Mary's life had simply stopped in a way that felt intentional. By midnight, the Jacobs home was swarmed with neighbors bringing casseroles, flashlights, and prayers. Porch lights stayed on down the street in a gesture of solidarity, the community clinging to a fragile hope. Yet beneath the comfort, a darker unease crept in. If someone could take Mary Jacobs in the middle of the day, under the clear Ohio sun, what else did it mean for the safety of their town? The night of May 15, 2012 ended without answers. Only questions, deepening shadows, and the chilling realization that Mary had not just disappeared, she had been erased. The first 3 days after Mary Ellen Jacobs' disappearance were a blur of frantic action, mounting dread and haunting silence. Investigators knew from the beginning that the clock was ticking. The chances of locating a missing person alive dropped dramatically after the 72-hour mark. By dawn on May 16th, the search had already expanded beyond the Kroger lot. Dayton police organized ground teams, aided by volunteers who poured in from the neighborhood. Bloodhounds were brought in to track her scent from the sedan, and for a few hundred yards they seemed to pick up a trail. The dogs veered toward the tree line that bordered the far edge of the lot, circling near a drainage ditch before losing the scent abruptly. It was as though Mary had walked a short distance and then vanished into thin air. Helicopters scanned the nearby fields and roads. Officers waded into the drainage ditch, pulling out discarded soda cans and damp clothing. But nothing tied back to Mary. A dive team even swept the riverbank 2 miles away, fearing the worst, but again came up empty. Detectives interviewed everyone who had been in the parking lot that morning. The cashier remembered Mary clearly. Polite, calm, nothing unusual, she said. A young man pushing carts noted a woman in a blue blouse but couldn't recall if she got into her car. Others claimed they saw her vehicle parked for hours after she was last seen, untouched. The most compelling tip came from a delivery driver who thought he saw Mary speaking with a man near the passenger side of her sedan. Just before 11 a.m., he described the man as medium build, wearing a baseball cap, standing close enough that Mary seemed uncomfortable. Yet, when pressed, he admitted he'd only glimpsed the exchange from a distance while backing his truck. Inside the police department, the Jacobs case quickly escalated to high priority. Detectives combed her phone and bank records. No suspicious withdrawals, no unusual calls, no evidence of planning a disappearance. Her last purchase was groceries, her last call to her daughter. Everything pointed to a routine day, until it didn't. Thomas Jacobs was interrogated as a matter of procedure. He was cooperative, his grief visible. "We were fine," he told detectives. "Our marriage wasn't perfect, but we were fine. She loved the kids too much to leave them." His alibi checked out. He was at work that morning, co-workers confirming his presence until lunch. The family home showed no signs of disturbance. Mary's children, especially her teenage daughter, were devastated. She told police about their phone call, how normal it had been. "She sounded happy," the daughter said through tears. "She told me she was making chicken for dinner. She wouldn't just stop." Meanwhile, the public began to take notice. Flyers with Mary's face spread across Dayton. News stations ran segments, replaying the Kroger footage on loop. Viewers called in tips, some helpful, most not. One claimed to have seen Mary in Cincinnati. Another swore she was in a local motel. Each lead drained resources. Each dead end deepened despair. By the third day, the investigation reached a troubling impasse. The forensics lab confirmed that the smudged print on Mary's doorframe wasn't clear enough to compare in databases. The quarter found on the passenger side floor carried no usable prints. Tire impressions around the lot revealed dozens of overlapping tracks, none distinct enough to isolate. The only piece of evidence that continued to haunt detectives was the timeline. Between 10:47 a.m., when she left Kroger, and 11:02, when her phone went dark, Mary had 15 minutes of unaccounted time. 15 minutes that could explain everything, or nothing. Community volunteers expanded the search radius to 10 miles. They combed wooded areas, checked abandoned buildings, and walked shoulder to shoulder through fields. Each night ended with empty hands, the weight of futility pressing heavier on everyone involved. On May 18th, the third day, the lead investigator, Detective Claire Donovan, addressed the media. Standing before microphones, her face drawn with exhaustion, she spoke carefully. "We are pursuing every lead and continuing our search. At this time, we have no evidence suggesting Mary Jacobs left voluntarily. We ask anyone who saw anything unusual in the Kroger parking lot on Tuesday morning to come forward." Her words were deliberate. But the subtext was clear. Authorities suspected foul play. For the Jacobs family, the first 72 hours stretched into a lifetime. Nights blurred with days, hope clashed with dread, and every ring of the phone jolted them with a mixture of fear and longing. By the end of that window, the mystery had only deepened. Mary's absence was no longer just unexplained. It was starting to feel irreversible. By the end of the first week, investigators faced the pressure of both time and community expectation. People wanted answers, and when answers don't come quickly, suspicion begins to point inward. The first shadow of doubt fell on someone close to Mary, a man named Rick Halpern, a co-worker at the insurance office where she had spent the past 15 years. Rick had a reputation for being friendly on the surface, but his colleagues described him as volatile beneath the charm. He had once been reprimanded for making overly personal comments toward Mary, though she brushed it off to friends, telling them he was just awkward, she admitted. Privately, that his attention sometimes made her uncomfortable. When detectives learned that Rick drove a dark-colored SUV and lived less than 5 miles from the Kroger, the alarm bells grew louder. They brought him in for questioning. Under the fluorescent lights of the interrogation room, Rick looked more irritated than nervous. "Mary was my friend," he insisted. "I wouldn't hurt her. She was kind to me when no one else in that office cared." He claimed he had been home alone that morning fixing a leaky sink. No one could verify the alibi. More troubling, his phone records showed a brief call placed to Mary's number 2 nights before her disappearance. Investigators pressed him. "I called her about a file she left at work," Rick explained, shifting in his seat. "She didn't pick up." "That's it." Detectives searched his vehicle. The SUV was clean, almost too clean, the carpets freshly shampooed. In the back, they found a small toolkit, some rope, and a pair of gloves. None of it was illegal, but combined with his history of uncomfortable behavior, it was enough to stir unease. The community latched onto the theory quickly. Neighbors whispered about Rick's temper. Co-workers recalled unsettling interactions. The local news reported that a person of interest was under investigation. Though his name wasn't officially released, it didn't take long for word to spread. Rick's face, once just another among Dayton's working class, now carried the burden of implied guilt. Detective Claire Donovan knew better than to rely on assumptions. She pushed her team to verify facts. Forensics combed Rick's car for trace evidence, fibers, hair, blood. They found nothing that tied him to Mary. The rope and gloves were standard hardware store items, purchased months earlier, and receipts backed up his story. More importantly, when investigators re-examined surveillance footage from the Kroger area, they spotted Rick's SUV, but it was time-stamped at 9:30 a.m., more than an hour before Mary vanished. Traffic cameras later placed him driving back toward his home at 10:15, a full half hour before she was last seen. It wasn't airtight, timelines can be manipulated, but the growing body of evidence began to undercut the suspicion. Then came the decisive test, a DNA sample collected from Rick. For weeks, labs compared it against the faint smudge lifted from Mary's car door. The results were clear, no match. When detectives confronted him with the results, Rick exhaled sharply, a mixture of anger and relief. "I told you," he snapped. "I had nothing to do with this. But now half the city thinks I did." It was true. The damage to his reputation lingered long after the investigation shifted away from him. People avoided him in the grocery store, whispered when he walked by. In the eyes of the public, suspicion leaves stains that even truth cannot always wash away. For investigators, clearing Rick was bittersweet. On one hand, it meant they hadn't falsely accused an innocent man. On the other, it reset the case back to zero. If not Rick, then who? The red herring phase had consumed precious time and energy. It had offered a potential answer, a narrative that almost fit, but in the end, it unraveled. The truth was still out there, just beyond reach, waiting to be uncovered. And with each passing day, the silence around Mary's disappearance grew louder. By the second week of Mary Ellen Jacobs's disappearance, Dayton had become a city on edge. Posters bearing her smiling face were taped to lampposts, gas stations, and bus stops. The photo, Mary in her checkered blouse, hair pulled back, looking like she might be heading to a family picnic, soon became the most recognized image in the city. The Jacobs family organized nightly prayer vigils. Neighbors crowded into church basements, holding candles, murmuring hymns, and pleading for answers. Mary's daughter, Stephanie, just 19, stood before the cameras one night with tears streaking her face.
"If anyone has my mom, please let her come home," she begged.
She promised she'd make dinner. That's all she wanted, to come home. The footage aired on every local station, replayed again and again until it became seared into the collective memory. The media swarmed the case. Out-of-town crews parked vans outside the Jacobs' modest home. Commentators speculated openly, sometimes cruelly. Was this a carjacking gone wrong? Did Mary live a secret life no one knew about? Rumors began to sprout like weeds. A radio host suggested she might have staged her disappearance to escape financial stress. On Facebook, anonymous posters whispered about affairs, debts, even ties to criminal networks. None of it was true, but the longer the silence lasted, the more people filled it with imagination. Detectives found themselves in a double bind. They needed public attention to keep the case alive, but the flood of tips became overwhelming. Hundreds of calls poured in. Sightings of Mary in gas stations, shopping malls, even 3 states away. Most were dead ends, but every claim had to be logged, vetted, and closed out. The manpower drain was immense. Meanwhile, the Jacobs family bore the brunt of suspicion. Reporters hounded David Jacobs, Mary's husband, asking if their marriage had been troubled. His weary face appeared on news segments, repeating the same line. Mary was my wife. She loved her family. She didn't run away. Yet even his steadfast defense could not stop the undercurrent of doubt that flows whenever someone vanishes without explanation. The police tried to control the narrative, releasing selective details. They emphasized the last confirmed sighting at the Kroger lot. They confirmed her phone had gone dark just after 11 a.m. They denied rumors of a ransom note. Still, the gaps in the story created fertile ground for gossip. At one press conference, a reporter asked Detective Claire Donovan if she believed Mary was still alive. Donovan paused, her jaw tight. "We're treating this as a missing person investigation," she said carefully. "Our goal is to bring Mary home." It wasn't the reassurance the public wanted. By midsummer, the case had become more than a family tragedy. It was a community obsession. Volunteers combed fields and wooded areas, sometimes against police advice, convinced they could find something investigators had missed. A group of college students even organized a crowd-funded billboard campaign with Mary's photo and the hotline number. Yet beneath the surface, fatigue began to set in. The constant vigils, the daily news reports, the endless stream of tips that led nowhere, it all chipped away at hope. What had started as a collective cry for justice was slowly giving way to a quieter, more unsettling reality. Mary might never come home, and the truth might remain buried forever. For the Jacobs family, the weight of public scrutiny was almost as crushing as the not knowing. Every headline, every whisper, every speculative glance at the grocery store reminded them that Mary's absence was not only personal, it was painfully, relentlessly public. By the spring of 2013, the rhythm of Mary Ellen Jacobs' case had slowed to a painful crawl. The urgency of the first few weeks, sirens, helicopters, search grids marked in red, had long since faded. The posters on telephone poles were sun-bleached and curling at the corners, a sad reminder of promises made and unkept. Detectives continued to chase tips, but each one fizzled out in the same familiar way. A woman in Cincinnati swore she saw Mary in a diner. A drifter in Kentucky claimed he'd spoken with a woman who looked like her at a bus terminal. An anonymous caller suggested Mary had staged everything, pointing to internet rumors about an old flame. Every lead collapsed under scrutiny, leaving the case file thicker but no closer to resolution. Behind closed doors at the Dayton Police Department, frustration set in. Detectives rotated off the case. Resources were redirected toward more immediate crimes, homicides, narcotics, gang activity. It wasn't that they didn't care. It was that after a year, the trail had gone cold. The decision came quietly, almost bureaucratically. In the summer of 2013, the case was officially reclassified as a cold case, moved from the active missing persons unit to a storage cabinet overseen by the department's cold case division. A clerical act, but for the Jacobs family, it felt like a funeral without a body. When reporters asked about the shift, the department offered carefully measured words. The investigation remains open and will be revisited as new information or technology becomes available. But everyone understood what it meant. The spotlight had dimmed. The front-page headlines were gone. Dayton had other stories now. For Mary's daughter, Stephanie, the change was unbearable. She attended the meeting where detectives explained the transition, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white. "So you're giving up?" she asked, her voice breaking. The lead detective shook his head. "Not giving up," he said, "just waiting for something new." But waiting sounded like surrender. The community, too, moved on. The vigils became smaller, less frequent. Neighbors stopped asking as often. Even the billboard campaign ended when donations dried up. Where once there had been daily chatter about Mary, there was now silence. An absence, yet silence did not mean forgetting. The Jacobs family kept Mary's room untouched, her phone charger still on the nightstand, her favorite cookbook still marked with notes in the margins. On the anniversary of her disappearance, they lit candles and prayed aloud that someone, somewhere, would finally speak up. In Dayton's cold case files, Mary's name joined dozens of others, each a puzzle missing its final piece. But hers carried with it a lingering ache. A woman who had left a grocery store in broad daylight, with people around her, cameras watching, and yet somehow vanished without leaving a trace. The city didn't know it yet, but the answer was still out there, waiting. Technology would one day whisper the truth that human eyes and ears had missed. Nearly a decade after Mary Ellen Jacobs vanished, her case remained a file in a gray cabinet at the Dayton Police Department. Quiet, undisturbed, waiting, But in 2021, a ripple of change swept through law enforcement. A surge in advanced forensic technology, particularly genetic genealogy and high-resolution DNA profiling. What once seemed impossible suddenly had promise. In early 2021, Dayton's Cold Case Division conducted a routine audit of dormant files, and Mary's case surfaced. Tucked inside were small evidence envelopes, dusty, forgotten, but intact. Among them was a cotton swab from the interior of her silver sedan, collected in the frantic days after the car had been processed. At the time, the lab had flagged it as insufficient for comparison. The technology wasn't sensitive enough then. But now, with new methods capable of extracting full profiles from degraded or trace samples, the evidence was given another look. The sample was rushed to a state lab in Columbus that specialized in advanced DNA sequencing. Weeks passed. Then a phone call came that shook the department. A partial profile had been recovered, strong enough to search against national databases. At first, the CODIS system came back with no direct hits. For many investigators, that might have been another dead end. But the lab didn't stop there. They moved to the newer, more controversial technique of genetic genealogy, mapping the recovered DNA against public genealogy databases to identify potential relatives. What emerged was a cluster of distant matches, second and third cousins, scattered across Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana. Building family trees from those names became a meticulous puzzle, requiring genealogists to layer census records, obituaries, and marriage licenses. Piece by piece, the branches narrowed. Eventually, all roads pointed toward a single family living not far from Dayton. One man in particular fit the age, location, and timeline. A quiet, middle-aged resident who had lived in the area in 2012 and still did. His name surfaced not because he had ever been a suspect, but because his genetic shadow lingered in the branches of a family tree, leading straight back to him. For investigators, the moment was electric. After nearly 10 years of silence, Mary Ellen's case had a heartbeat again. The technology had pulled something invisible into the light, a trace of someone who had been in her car that day. Someone who wasn't supposed to be there. Someone who had left behind just enough of himself to be caught, decades later, by science he could never have imagined. What had once been a mystery, sealed by time, now cracked open. And with that crack came a name, a suspect hiding in plain sight. The name that surfaced from the genetic genealogy puzzle was Mark Ellison, a 52-year-old maintenance worker who had lived in Dayton most of his life. On paper, Mark looked unremarkable. He owned a modest single-story house on the edge of town, paid his property taxes, and kept largely to himself. To neighbors, he was the quiet man who waved politely when mowing his lawn, the type who occasionally fixed a squeaky gate or lent out a tool. Nothing about him screamed danger, and yet, as detectives began pulling old records, an unsettling pattern emerged. Mark had once worked at the very Kroger where Mary Ellen was last seen. His employment records showed that he clocked out shortly before 10:30 a.m. on May 15, 2012, barely 20 minutes before. Mary exited the store and disappeared into the parking lot. At the time, he wasn't considered a suspect. He wasn't on the radar. He had no violent criminal history, no obvious motive, no direct tie to Mary, but the DNA didn't lie. Investigators retraced his life in 2012 and realized how close he had been without anyone noticing. He lived less than 3 miles from Mary Ellen's home. He drove a silver sedan not unlike hers, often parking it on side streets near the grocery. A former co-worker remembered him as quiet, but with a habit of lingering in the parking lot on breaks, watching people come and go. In hindsight, it was eerie. Mark had been woven into the fabric of the case all along, not as a central figure, but as background noise, so ordinary that he was overlooked. Detectives began tailing him discreetly, observing his routines. He still worked maintenance at a local factory, often stopping at the same diner after shifts. He kept to himself, reading the paper, drinking coffee from the same chipped mug he always brought with him. He volunteered occasionally at a church charity drive, repairing donated furniture. People saw him as reliable, if slightly withdrawn. What chilled investigators most was how seamlessly he had blended in while carrying a secret so grave. He wasn't a drifter or an outsider. He was someone the community trusted enough to hand their car keys to when they needed a quick repair. He was the type of neighbor who offered to watch a house while a family was on vacation. As detectives compared notes, they realized this was the archetype of the hidden suspect. A man without headlines. A man who left no trail because he gave no reason for suspicion. But science had pulled him from the shadows. The challenge now was to confirm it wasn't coincidence. The genealogical leads were strong, but investigators needed a direct DNA sample from Mark Ellison. The plan to get it would require patience, subtlety, and an understanding of his habits. For the first time in years, the name of a living man was whispered in connection with Mary Ellen Jacobs. The person who had walked free in Dayton for over a decade might finally be unmasked, not because of a confession or a slip-up, but because the truth had been quietly coded in his blood. By spring 2022, detectives had built a quiet but growing case against Mark Ellison. The genealogical evidence suggested a connection, but it wasn't enough to stand in court. What they needed was undeniable, scientific proof, DNA collected directly from him, compared against the trace found in Mary Ellen's car a decade earlier. That meant going covert. Detectives began studying Mark's routines like clockwork. Every morning, he left his small ranch-style home at 6:45 a.m. sharp, coffee thermos in hand, and drove the short route to the Dayton factory where he worked. He usually carried his lunch in a brown paper bag, eating alone in the break area. After work, he often stopped at a diner 2 blocks from the factory, ordering the same meal: scrambled eggs and hash browns, washed down with 2 cups of black coffee. It was at the diner that investigators saw their opportunity. Mark had a habit of lingering, reading the paper, and leaving his empty coffee cup behind when he left. On April 12th, a plainclothes detective sat 2 booths away, waiting. When Mark finished, he folded his paper neatly, pushed his chipped mug aside, and walked out into the sunshine. Minutes later, the detective slipped the cup into an evidence bag, sealed it, and rushed it to the lab. Chain of custody was airtight. The lab technicians swabbed the rim of the cup, extracting what they hoped would be a clear DNA sample. Days later, the phone call came. The excitement in the technician's voice was palpable. The sample was viable. When compared to the profile lifted from Mary Ellen's car, the result left no room for doubt. The alleles aligned, every marker falling into place. It wasn't partial. It wasn't approximate. It was exact. The report contained the line investigators had waited years to hear. DNA profile matches 100%. The weight of those words reverberated through the Dayton Police Department. A name, once hidden in the noise of everyday life, now stood in stark relief. The quiet maintenance worker, the man neighbors trusted, the one who had been overlooked for nearly 10 years, was suddenly at the center of Mary Ellen Jacobs' case. Detectives convened an emergency meeting with prosecutors. With the match in hand, the case had shifted from theory to certainty. They prepared an arrest warrant, double-checking every detail. The community had waited too long for answers, and this time, there could be no mistakes. As the sun set over Dayton on April 18, 2022, unmarked police cars rolled slowly down Mark Ellison's street. He had just returned home from work, unaware that the ordinary cup of coffee he left behind had shattered his carefully maintained facade. For the first time in nearly a decade, the mystery of Mary Ellen Jacobs' disappearance was on the brink of resolution. The truth was no longer hidden. It was written in his DNA. The morning of April 19, 2022 began quietly in Dayton. Neighbors on Pinecrest Drive stepped out to collect newspapers, start their cars, or water their lawns. Nothing seemed unusual. But just past 7:30 a.m., the stillness broke. A caravan of unmarked sedans rolled to a stop in front of a small, beige house with peeling paint and an overgrown lawn. Inside, Mark Ellison was finishing his coffee when the knock came. Loud, deliberate, final. Dayton police. Open the door. Through the blinds, curious neighbors began to gather, whispering to each other as uniformed officers moved in. Mark appeared at the doorway in his work clothes, bewildered. He asked what was going on, his voice carrying the same calm politeness people had always associated with him. But the detectives didn't waste words. They presented the warrant, stepped forward, and placed him in handcuffs. The scene unfolded with a surreal mix of silence and murmurs. For years, Mark had been the quiet neighbor who kept to himself, a man who fixed broken lawnmowers and read his newspaper in peace. Now he was being led down the front steps in handcuffs, flanked by officers in bulletproof vests. A reporter who lived nearby snapped the first photo, and within an hour, the image was on local news sites. Dayton man arrested in 2012 disappearance of Mary Ellen Jacobs. At the police station, prosecutors joined detectives in reading Mark's rights. On the table before him lay the case file, thick with over a decade of unanswered questions. But now, at the very top, sat the lab report. The one line that had shattered the stalemate. DNA profile matches 100%. It was irrefutable. News spread quickly across Dayton. Some residents admitted they barely knew Mark, but others were shaken to their core. "He fixed my screen door once," one woman told a reporter. "He was just normal." How could he have been walking around all these years with that secret? At Mary Ellen's church, where annual vigils had been held for a decade, bells tolled in solemn acknowledgement of the breakthrough. For her daughter, the arrest was bittersweet. "We prayed for answers, not this," she said tearfully, standing in front of the cameras. "But at least now we know who took her from us." For investigators, the arrest was the culmination of countless hours and years of frustration. The case had felt like a wound that would never close. Now, with a suspect in custody, there was hope of finally stitching together the truth. As Mark was escorted to his holding cell, his expression was unreadable, calm, even resigned. But beneath the stillness, detectives knew a reckoning had begun. Dayton had waited 10 long years for this moment. The silence of the past was broken, replaced by the sound of a steel cell door clanging shut on the man who had hidden in plain sight. The interrogation room at the Dayton Police Department was plain. Gray walls, a table scarred with years of use, and a single camera mounted in the corner. Mark Ellison sat with his hands folded, his demeanor calm but tense, as 2 seasoned detectives entered and slid the thick case file across the table. For hours, Mark deflected. He said he didn't know Mary Ellen Jacobs. He claimed he hadn't been near her car. He suggested the DNA was a mistake. But each denial was met with quiet persistence. Finally, a detective placed the lab report in front of him and tapped the words that had brought him there. DNA profile matches 100%. The weight of the evidence pressed down on the room. Mark's eyes flickered, his mask slipping for the first time. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling heavily, though he still didn't outright confess. Instead, detectives pivoted. They revealed pieces of the case that had never been made public. Details only the person involved could explain. They asked about the scuff mark on the inside of Mary Ellen's sedan near the passenger door, a mark consistent with a work boot. They mentioned the faint trace of motor oil found on her blouse, a detail no one outside the investigation knew. And then they asked about the car keys. When Mary Ellen's vehicle had been recovered, her keys were still in the ignition. It was a strange detail that never made sense to investigators. Why would someone leave them there, unless they wanted to make the disappearance look accidental, a case of someone walking away? At the mention of the keys, Mark's composure cracked. He shifted in his chair, his hands tightening around one another. The silence that followed was louder than any words. Detectives pressed harder, painting the picture. The day in 2012 when he left work at Kroger, the way he lingered in the lot, the moment Mary Ellen wheeled her groceries out. They described how he must have approached her, how he might have spoken to her with the same quiet voice her daughter remembered from their last call. Though he never offered a full confession, his responses betrayed him. When asked directly if he had been inside Mary Ellen's car, he looked down at the table and whispered, "I don't remember." When pressed about the oil stain, he muttered, "Could have been from work." It wasn't a confession, but it was enough. A web of circumstantial truth reinforced by science. Behind the glass, prosecutors and investigators exchanged glances. They didn't need him to spell it out. The DNA, the timeline, the hidden details confirmed what they had long suspected. For Mary Ellen's family, the revelations were painful but clarifying. The fact that her car keys had been left in the ignition, a chilling attempt to disguise her disappearance, was the hardest detail to hear. "He wanted us to think she just walked away," her daughter later said. "But we always knew she wouldn't." The interrogation ended with Mark being escorted back to his cell, silent once more. But silence no longer protected him. Every hidden detail, every overlooked clue, had finally converged. And now the path toward justice was clear. After Mark Ellison's arrest, Detectives turned their focus toward recovery. The Whitaker family had lived with absence for a decade. No grave to visit, no certainty about what had happened in Mary Ellen's final hours. They needed something tangible, something to anchor their grief. Investigators retraced old search grids using Mark's past work routes and habits to refine the map. One stretch of rural land outside Dayton, where Ellison had once taken side jobs repairing barns, stood out. It was here that ground-penetrating radar detected disturbances in the soil near a line of oak trees. The area had been searched years earlier, but technology back then was less precise. In late May 2022, a team quietly began digging. Under layers of earth and roots, they uncovered fragments of fabric, a light blue checkered blouse. The color was faded but unmistakable. Near it lay skeletal remains consistent with Mary Ellen's height and build. Forensic anthropologists confirmed what the family had dreaded but expected. After 10 years, Mary Ellen Jacobs had finally been found. Among the items recovered was a small silver locket, its clasp rusted but intact. Inside, beneath dirt and time, was a tiny photo of her 2 children. Her daughter, now an adult, was present when detectives returned the locket. She held it in trembling hands, tears welling in her eyes. "This is her," she whispered. "She never left us. She carried us with her until the end." The discovery gave the family a place to grieve. A private funeral was held in Dayton in June 2022, attended by friends, church members, and community members who had kept vigil over the years. Candles lined the church steps, just as they had during the long vigils, but this time the flames burned for closure rather than unanswered questions. Detectives, too, felt a profound weight lift. One officer admitted that finding Mary was as important to them as the arrest itself. "It's not just about accountability," he said. "It's about giving a family the chance to say goodbye." The recovery also became a turning point for the community. People who had spent years driving past missing posters and anniversary vigils now had resolution. The mystery that had haunted Dayton for so long was finally unraveling. Mary Ellen's final resting place was no longer a question mark on a missing persons flyer. It was a marked grave, a stone etched with her name, dates, and a simple inscription chosen by her family: "Forever loved, forever carried with us." Closure did not mean the pain vanished, but it transformed the grief into something bearable. For her family, it meant the end of searching, the end of wondering, and the beginning of remembering without the weight of uncertainty.